The large trophy now on display at First State Bank and on loan to the Odebolt Museum came with a condition. It had to be used for an educational purpose. This presentation on the history of Cook's Brookmont Farm is intended to satisfy that requirement. We believe that it will, for we were certainly educated and often surprised, amazed from all that we learned in our research. I spent some time in the Iowa State Library, but most of what we have found has come from the internet. It is an amazing research tool. Just 2 months ago, the historic newspapers of Odebolt became accessible online, and you will see that Dan has mined them well from faraway Kansas City. We are honored to have with us today a special guest, Jolene Dentlinger of Storm Lake. More than 30 years ago, Jolene, an artist seeking interesting old buildings to sketch and draw, stumbled upon the most awesome rustic old buildings imaginable. She soon found herself on a crusade of sorts to learn all she could about Brookmont Farm and the Cooks. In the days before the internet, it was an especially difficult and time-consuming undertaking. She gradually amassed a great deal of knowledge and has graciously shared that knowledge through countless presentations in this part of Iowa, especially in Odebolt. No doubt many of you know her personally, but this is the first time in 30 years that Jolene will be able to sit down, relax, and listen while someone else presents a history of Cook's Brookmont Farm. Perhaps we will sweat a little more with Jolene watching, but I think we're ready. And Jolene's sitting right over here and get a chance to talk to the rest of us. We are excited to announce today that Jolene has decided to author a book, finally decided to author a book on the history of Cook's Brookmont Farm. Just a few weeks ago, Alice and I met with Jolene and her husband Ray to encourage her to finally take on the book, a book that she has long thought about writing. For the museum, for our community, we pledge that Odebolt's support, financially and otherwise, and I am certain that support will come. The goal is for the book to be ready for distribution at Creek Days in 2016, so mark your calendar. All that Dan and I have independently uncovered in preparing for this presentation will be given to Jolene to supplement what she has learned, and with Kathy Larson and others here, we will continue to help with the research. Consider this presentation then a preview of parts of what that book about Cook's Brookmont Farm will contain. We think you will be impressed. Every point we show you today, there's a richer background to it. This presentation will take about an hour. A little bit less, I think, but we'll find out. We ask that questions be deferred until after the presentation. If you have information or artifacts of the Cook Ranch that you would be willing to tell us about or loan to the museum, please see Kathy Larson, John Curry, or Dan or myself, or me, after the presentation or in the coming weeks. And be sure to check out that fascinating trophy at First State Bank, viewable until 3 o'clock today and during bank hours through July 25. And look for the special float that John has made to commemorate the Brookmont as being the parade today. So thank you. We're ready to begin. We wanted to start off to talk to our young people, although there aren't a lot here, because Cook Ranch has been largely forgotten in Odebolt. Everybody knows still the Adams Ranch, but the Cook has faded. And with good reason. You can still go south of town and see some pieces of Adams, but the Cook is gone. But there were 2 large ranches formed in the Odebolt area. The Wheeler Ranch, purchased in 1871, was the first one, and it was sold to Adams in the 1890s. It was covered 10 square miles. The second, though, the one we're going to talk about today, is the Cook Ranch, also officially known as Cook's Brookmont Farm. It was purchased in 1873 and was, and still is, the largest contiguous farm in the history of the state. I'm certain there are farmers that farm more than 8,000 acres today, but at that time, one single farm together was a huge undertaking. And the one question I had, which we were able to answer, is why here? Why did Odebolt get the big farms? And in the back of the church here, there's an 1871 map of the Iowa Railroad Land Company that shows lands that were available for sale. The federal government gave land grants to the railroads to build the tracks. And because the population swarmed into Iowa so quickly, they had to push the lands to the west that they could give the railroads, and it resulted in clumps of large tracts of railroad land in this area. And that's the main reason that the big farms came to Odebolt before there was an Odebolt. This is a close-up of that particular map, and shown in yellow is the area that was purchased by C.W. Cook. All the dark spots would be land that the railroad owned, and then the white ground was land that the railroad didn't think they owned. You'll see here that the railroad sold Cook some ground that they maybe didn't think they owned, but that's another story. This then is what we remember, 1975 aerial photo. And there's a company that has amassed the old aerial photos of the farmsteads, and you can purchase photos from them. This then was taken in 1975, and it depicts what, at least from my perspective, my age group, what the farm looked like. Dan, for that next one. These are what the buildings look like before they got old. And for some scale, the big pavilion, which is our float today, and the corn crib were nearly 200 feet long, and the corn cribs could hold 150,000 bushel. The granary, the one in the northwest corner, was used for grinding feed and mixing feed. It had underground bins even, and it had a unique spiral staircase. And the little boy that lived right west of here got the chance to sneak up there now and then and explore that spiral staircase and that granary. And when you got to the top of that, you could see Odebolt. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to Dan to start the history.
Well, in putting this presentation together, I know for me, I've become very interested in my own genealogy. So for me, the history of the farm really kind of becomes the story of the family. So that's kind of the aspect that we've taken with this. But our main characters in today's story really are three generations of the Cook family: Willard Cook, Charles Willard Cook, his son, and then his son, Albert Eugene Cook. Next slide. So where did the Cooks come from? I always kind of wondered where did they come from? Where did they get the money to do all that they did? Well, their ancestry traces actually back to the Mayflower. So they're a very old New England family, settled in the Hartford, Connecticut area for actually several hundred years. Willard married into a very prominent Brainerd family in the 1820s, and he went into partnership with two of his brother-in-laws in a granite quarry in right around Hartford, Connecticut. And that quarry provided stone for some of the very first streets and sidewalks in New York City, in Philadelphia, and they even exported stone to New Orleans. Through the 1830s, I also need to mention the Fort Hamilton thing. This is kind of neat. The stone also provided stone to build Fort Hamilton in New York City, and the person who was in charge of building Fort Hamilton was Robert E. Lee, who would obviously become the director of the Confederate Army later on. Willard and Abigail had two sons, Ansel Brainerd Cook, the older son, and then Charles Willard was the younger son by about 9 years. The quarry eventually became unprofitable, and they chose to go west. And they made a very precarious journey and ended up in Libertyville, Illinois, right outside of what was then a very small city of Chicago. and they actually farmed for about 7 years. And this is where I believe that Charles kind of was first exposed to Midwestern agriculture. In 1853, an opportunity to own a new quarry in the city of Chicago came available. And Willard and his sons decided that they wanted to purchase this and go back into the quarry business. So next slide, Dan. So we've now discovered that the location of that quarry in Chicago is now the actual site of the Sears Tower, called the Woo, which isn't that amazing? So Ansel Cook, who was Charles Willard's brother, he made a fortune in the stone business after the Great Chicago Fire. Obviously, there was a great demand for stone after the fire to rebuild Chicago. So Charles Willard's brother made a lot of money, and his home in Libertyville is actually a museum and historic site in the city of Libertyville, Illinois. So you can go there and go tour that house. And that's part of our Cook family. Okay, so talk a little bit about how did Charles Willard get all this money to come out here and buy all this farmland? Well, he must have been a very astute, driven young man, because all through his 20s, he just worked extremely hard and built he had a tremendous portfolio of businesses. Wholesale coal, banking, he had a large timber holding in northern Michigan, he owned a streetcar company, and he also was very strong in real estate and built many of the stone blocks that became the west side of Chicago. He was also served on the director of several banks, 3 insurance companies, and the steam railroad. So he was a very busy, this is all before he was 30 years old. Next step. In 1857, he married Sarah A. Coonley of Albany, New York. And I do not know how they met. That's something that we still kind of need to figure out. They would have 4 children that we know of. 3 of them survived to adulthood. Their oldest son, Willard, died shortly before his 6th birthday in 1866. They would have 2 other sons, Charles Ira Cook and Albert Eugene Cook, and then a daughter, Emma. In 1864, when Albert was 32 years old, he had some sort of health issue that we still haven't been able to quite figure out what it was. It sounds to me like it was some sort of burnout from all the work that he had been doing in his 20s. So he began to basically sell out all of his holdings in his businesses and essentially retired at the age of 32. And he and the family then kind of took a vacation to Europe for 3 years. Sometime after 1867, they left Chicago and went to Europe for 3 years for kind of an extended vacation. So Cook returns then to Chicago and is now looking for less stressful capitalistic opportunities to invest in. And he had two business associates. One of them was Hiram Wheeler, who in 1871 owned the very ground on which we stand right now. He also was very good friends with a man named Marvin Hewitt, who at that time was the general manager of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. And they were obviously developing railroads in western Iowa. And Wheeler and Hewitt told Cook that there was some great land in western Iowa and that would be a great investment for him, and he should go out and take a look. So we believe that in 1872, Cook made his first trip out here, and the railroad line had just been completed to Council Bluffs through what would be along Highway 30 today, and it had just been completed, and he met some railroad executives at Denison. And I found this description of his first trip to Odebolt, and I really like it, so I'm going to read it to you. I think it's really cool. But jolting along over the newly built Omaha branch of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, Mr. Cook got off at Denison, Iowa. Taking a Bronco team and a buckboard, Mr. Cook drove due north among the blue stem and hazelbrush, among the Indians, wolves, etc., over and around hill, through and across the winding vales in a northerly course to the land that Mr. Hewitt had assured him had no superior on earth. Oh, I think that's just a great description. I love that. I'm really biased. But also in our research, when Dad and I were down in the Iowa State Library, we stumbled across an old atlas, and this was a real shocker for us. And this was 1875 Western Sac County. And you can see that I've highlighted where the 12 square miles that Cook purchased are on the map. And you'll see that there's a black line that runs right through that ground. And that was a proposed railroad that was to connect Sac City to Ida Grove. And that is the reason, that was our hypothesis was, well, that must be why Cook decided to purchase the land that he purchased. So that was a real shocker. We had no idea that there'd ever been a railroad. So that was our hypothesis. So next slide, Dan. Well, within the last 2 weeks, you find things in amazing places. I just happened to stumble on Amazon.com a book that was written by one of C.W. Cook's grandsons. It's about a trip, it's about a one-year camping or hunting trip that he took along the Minnesota boundary waters in 1919. But the first 3 paragraphs of that book describe his father and his grandfather's farm in western Iowa. And it's very clear in that book that Cook knew, he had advanced knowledge because he was friends of the railroad executive, that there was going to be a railroad that was going to go through his land, and that is why he purchased the land that he did. Some other things that happened to Charles during this time. In 1872, his wife, just 35 years old, tragically passes away, leaving him a widower with 3 children under the age of 10. He also loses his father the following year, and in 1874 he marries his second wife, Jenny Wade Sturgis of Washington, D.C. We've got to do some research on her and figure out how they met and all that. We haven't done it yet. But Jenny really becomes kind of the adopted mother of the 3 children, and she raises them, and they love her like a mother. Another part of the deal that came along with marrying Jenny was that her mother was kind of the package. So she was always traveled with them, lived with them for the next 20, 30 years. And she became Grandma Wade, and I'll talk about her a little bit later on in the presentation. So Brookmont begins. On April 15th, 1873, Charles Willard Cook closed on the 12 square miles that made up the Brookmont farm. He paid $5 an acre, which at that time was $38,400. Now, if you extrapolate that out into what's $38,400 today, it's only $700,000 for 12 square miles of some of the greatest farmland that there is. So he got a really good deal, all right? This was a steal, all right? So they began to plan a large grain and cattle farm on that ground. It was going to be kind of built on what was called the tenant model, which is different from the Adams farm, which had a central hub. The tenant farm, we have tenants all the way around. There were going to be 23 tenant farms, and then obviously the central headquarters plant. The first manager of the farm was a gentleman by the name of Jacob Anderson. Cook met him out in Chicago area, and I don't know how they knew each other, but Cook told Jacob, you know, you'd be a great manager out at my ranch out in western Iowa, but you're not married, and you need to get married if you want to go out and do that. So he went back and I guess talked to whoever he was dating, and she agreed. And I don't know if she realized what she was getting herself into, but she came out and they got married, and he came out, and he was the one who really got the farm started. He was the one who brought all of the signature trees to the farm, and this is a fascinating story as well. Obviously, one of the signatures of Brookmont were the tree-lined roads. Every square mile, all around the farm were lined with trees, and most of those were cottonwoods. And those cottonwoods were pulled from the Missouri River bottoms south of Sioux City and hauled overland and planted. We estimate that there would have been about 60,000 of them. So you imagine what an amazing undertaking that was. And that's actually Jacob's, his job. He treated those trees like crops in the early years to make sure they grow. They were tended to, they were watered, they were weeded to make sure that they were going to grow. So the first 6 or 7 years was really spent just developing the farm. There really wasn't really much there. And the Cook family, they didn't really come out that much because it was just Jacob was getting things started. The first mansion. Now, we're not really certain exactly when it was built, but we believe, based on what I can pull together, I believe it was built sometime between 1879 and 1882. But this was just a spectacular. The first mansion was absolutely spectacular. It had all the modern conveniences for a home of 1880, gas lighting, running water. Now, the Cooks only lived there during the growing season. They would arrive in May, and they'd stay through the growing season, and then in the wintertime, they would go to California, typically Coronado Island, which sounds terrible, or they go back to Chicago, or they would actually even travel abroad, because they had a lot of money, and they could do what they wanted to. The Herefords, this is great. I love this. In June of 1883, CW and a team, now we're going to get serious about the farm. CW and a team went over to Herefordshire, England, and they selected 306 Herefords from 4 different very prominent breeders. He paid $200,000 for those 306 head. That's $4.5 million today. So he had about 5 or 6 times as much in his cattle as he did in his land. Those Herefords took a special chartered train from Herefordshire to Liverpool, where they boarded a specially chartered ship that Cook had chartered. And they spent 11 days aboard that ship crossing the Atlantic. And then they got to Canada, where they spent a 3-month quarantine. And then on September 30th, it's in the Chronicle, so you know it's true. September 30th, 1883, a dedicated train of 23 cars from Quebec pulled into the train depot right out across from the bank, carrying what was then the largest importation of Hereford cattle in American history. So that's neat. Now, the Hereford's new home, and this is something that we need to figure out more on, but I want to explain it. So obviously, Cook's got a lot of money in these cattle, and they're not going to just go out and be pastured out on the farm when you spend $4.5 million on cattle. So reports say that Cook had the largest cattle barn built in the United States ready for those cattle when they arrived in 1883. It was 200 feet square by 50 feet tall. So those buildings, the cribs that were 200 Dad was talking about, so take that and put it on its side. So that's 200 feet. Had stalls for 700 head and cost about $615,000 today. There was an observation cupola in the top that the journalists could report seeing most of Sac County and most of Ida County from. Adjacent to that hay barn, completed the next year, was a 16-sided railroad roundhouse-like hay barn that could hold 800 tons of hay. And in 1884, it had a steam-powered conveyor system that could transport the hay from this hay barn to the center of the large cattle barn. So this must have just been incredible. But we've never found any pictures of it. If I could find one thing, that would be the one thing I'd like to see, would be that. Next slide now. So we go through the 1880s. The central plant waterworks system was completed. Water was forced from the spring using a wind turbine, and then all these massive buildings, the home, the barn, the hay barn, were all connected to water. And of course, the idea was to make them fireproof. Well, as we know, they all burn at some point in the future, so that's kind of interesting. The first Hereford sale was the next year, and that was made to J.C. Powell of Guthrie Center, and he'll come back in our story later on. By 1885, the Herefords had grown to 500 head, and that made them the largest Hereford herd in the world. Some family connections here, and I mentioned earlier that C.W. had a large timber holding in Michigan. Well, he was partners with a man named William Oscar Carpenter in that timber. And it turns out that Charles Willard's 2 kids, Charles Ira and Emma, married 2 of William Oscar's kids. So it's kind of a family connection here that ties these 2 super wealthy families together. Now, it appeared that Charles Ira was going to be the heir apparent, and he was going to be the one that was going to run the farm. But when he married Elizabeth, she had other plans, and I confirmed that in that book that I found, that Mom was not going to live out on the prairie. Okay? So, next slide, Don. This is what happened to Charles Ira, C.W.'s oldest son. Fascinating story. He left Brookmont in 1891 to move to Menominee, Michigan. And that's where Elizabeth was from. And he kind of got into partnership with his father-in-law, and they started what was called the Carpenter Cook Wholesale Grocery Chain, or grocers. They provided food to grocery stores. That brand existed until 1986. He had multiple food refining and production companies, employed 1,500 people in Menominee. And in 1902, he built the Menominee Opera House. Now, one of the things I'd like to find for the museum is their house brand was called Wigwam. You can see that over there in the lower left. And it says Carpenter Cook right on it. And that would be a neat little archive, or a neat little thing to find for the museum, would be something that says Carpenter Cook that's tied back to our farm like that. The youngest daughter, Emma Cook, she married Frederick Ice Carpenter, and he was the professor of English literature at the University of Chicago. And he taught there for a number of years, and then when his father passed away, he inherited a large estate. He gave a lot of that estate to the University of Chicago, and there are still things on campus today that bear his name. Like the home that they lived in was donated to the campus. There's still a Frederick Ives Carpenter lecture series all of these years later. And daughter Emma, she died in 1960 at the age of 92. So this leaves Albert left. And Albert was a very passionate farmer, but in 1891 with brother in Michigan, this is when Albert kind of began to take operational control of the farm. Another interesting story about how Albert met his wife. In July of 1892, Albert was over in Europe on business. And he was returning home from Liverpool aboard the ship, the City of Rome, and there's the ship. Aboard that ship, he met the young daughter of the lumber inspector of the city of New York City named Christina Drysdale Smith. And they fell in love coming home. It's kind of like Titanic, except they were both rich and the ship never went down. In August, he went back out to Jersey City where she lived and proposed marriage, and she accepted. And then C.W. and Jenny invited her and her father, her mother had passed away, invited her and her father to come out to Odebolt to see the farm. So in September they came out. And that's when Grandma Wade makes an appearance in our story, the kind of the step-grandmother. She, once she heard the wedding plans, she did not want to travel out to New Jersey and then have to go all the way back to California for the winter. So she insisted they get married at the farm right then and there. Okay? So they did. Because we're going to make Grandma happy. So on September 29th, 1892, have all the details, 8 p.m., all right, the Brookmont home was decorated in green and pink ribbon. There were flowers from every nook and cranny. Belle Wheeler, who I believe would have been the grandson or granddaughter of Hiram Wheeler, the Wheeler Ranch at that time, she served as the ring bearer. The ceremony took place in the drawing room of the big mansion, and F.D. McCrae, who was the pastor of this very church at the time, officiated the ceremony. So they're married. These are their 6 children. 5 of them would survive to adulthood, and I'll kind of tell that story as a later part of the presentation. But all the Cook children, what I think is interesting, all the Cook children were born at the farm. Next slide, Dan. So we had a tough stretch here of about a year. In December of 1893, Jenny Cook, who was the second wife of C.W. and the adopted mother of the kids, she dies at the farm. After a long illness. They didn't leave that winter because they didn't want to move her, and she died, and C.W. is widowed for a second time. Grandma Wade passes away the next year, and then the following winter, January 30th, 1895, the large Cook mansion burns to the ground in less than an hour. $20,000 in damage, about $500,000 today, but no one is injured. So that brings us to the second mansion, the home that many of us remember out on the farm. And this home, miraculously, and we're still trying to figure out how this was done, but was constructed in just 4 months. The Cooks moved in June of 1895, only 4 months after the big mansion burned down. And we're still trying to figure out how exactly that happened. The reports of the Chronicle state that the community was extremely proud that they were able to support building a home that rapidly. So I don't know how you build a foundation. They must have used some of the foundation of the old home, but they did it. So late 1890s, C.W. marries his third wife, another wealthy widower named Mary Fairchild, and she signs a prenuptial agreement. This is all in the abstracts of our farms. Just thought it was interesting. So she renounces any claim to the Cook fortune. And also at this time, in 1898, the 16-sided hay barn, we know that burned to the ground that year. And the building that was Machinery Hall right here became converted to hay, and then eventually it became the sales pavilion. The death of Charles Willard. In August of 1900, Charles was at the farm and got an infection of the bladder that got worse. Albert called for his brother and sister to come from Michigan, and they did. And on Saturday, August 11th, 1900, Charles Willard Cook died out at his beloved farm, and all three of his children were there. C.W. is interred at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago with his mother and his father. I found a picture of the gravestone just in the last couple of weeks. I was thrilled to find that. Just north of Wrigley Field. And his estate was to be divided equally amongst all three children. So then Albert bought out his brother and sister's share of the farm, and he became the sole proprietor. So this is where Albert's Brookmont begins. And he made several changes to the farm in the way it was run and managed, but most importantly, at least for our story, is that he began to work very closely with Iowa State in experimenting in grain and cattle. And that's where I'm going to turn this over to Dad to talk about the next piece.
Perry G. Holden. He's the reason that trophy is over at the bank. And the reason we have to tell you about it. Perry was born in 1865 in Minnesota, but raised in Michigan. He went to Michigan State University and became an expert in corn and ended up being the first agronomy professor in the United States at Illinois Ag College, or University of Illinois today. While he was in college and in future employment, he did independent research on corn, and at that time he met an enterprising farmer in Illinois named James Reed. James had developed, quite by accident, what was called Reed's Yellow Dent corn. And if those ears over in the bank are genuine from 1907, that is Reed's Yellow Dent corn. Today we have hybrid corn. This is before hybrid. But the germplasm of today's hybrid corn is more than 50% Reed's Yellow Dent corn. In 1901, Holden took a job with the Funk Brothers Seed Company in Illinois. Over at Iowa State, the college was the Iowa State College was had just started what were called winter short courses, 2 or 3 week sessions in January or February, where the farmers would come to Ames and be instructed on animal husbandry and other things associated with better farming. It was decided that they should add corn instruction in 1902, and Perry Holden was singled out as a fellow that they wanted to bring to Ames to give that instruction. He agreed to come. He wowed the farmers. There wasn't enough sessions scheduled during the day, so the farmers asked for more sessions on corn, and he actually started his instructions at 5 in the morning that year. Imagine a college kid going there? Anyway, Professor Beardsher, or the president, Beardsher of the college, and the first ag college dean, Charles Curtis, determined that they wanted to get this guy in the faculty. So they approached him, and he was willing to come back to academia, but he needed some help with the salary. He would even take a big pay cut, but they were still like 30% short. So Dean Curtis went out to seek people that would help pay the salary of Perry Holden so that he could be brought to Ames. And he sought out 3 benefactors of the college: Henry Wallace, Wallace's farmer; William P. Adams, Fairview Farm, Odebolt; and Albert Eugene Cook. They each committed what was today would be about $5,000 a year for 10 years. That's a sizable sum even today. So Perry Holden, as part of these winter short courses, established what was called the Corn Show. It became extremely popular in Iowa. The seed dealers and the forage clubs and other clubs would send their corn to this corn show to compete for premiums and recognition. If a corn seed dealer could say, "I won the corn show contest," he could sell a lot more corn. It was such a big deal in 1903 that Holden decided to make it bigger in 1904 and to introduce traveling trophies. And there were 2 commissioned for that year. One was requested of his friend and benefactor, Albert Cook, to furnish a trophy to go to the exhibitor of the winning single ear of corn. And Holden asked him to spend up to $400 for that trophy. Well, that is $10,000 today. But Cook decided to up the ante. He decided to make this trophy a memorial to his recently deceased father. That's our opinion anyway. And he commissioned a trophy 4 times that price, that size. And if you've seen the trophy, you see the resemblance to the conceptual drawing here that led to the creation of that trophy. Roughly $40,000 today was spent to make that trophy. It was to be delivered to Ames for the 1904 corn show. And we have the premium book from that show that shows that this trophy was to be the prize. But when it got to Iowa State, whoa, this is too big. No farmer can take that home, and no wife's going to find a place to put it in her house. So they did not use the trophy in January of 2004, but Holden had another idea. He proposed to set up a corn judging contest between the land-grant universities. And that started that year in Chicago in 1904, November. And the land-grant colleges were invited to send teams in to compete. And of course, favored Iowa State marched in there to win their trophy, and Kansas beats them. And Kansas Ag takes the trophy home for the first year. Greatly humiliated. I suspect that the college added a second course on corn judging to their curriculum. We've seen that. And the next 3 years, Iowa State won the trophy and brought it back to Ames. But that was the last year. The scientists then knew, and there's a big history here and fascinating, but the colleges by then knew that it wasn't just the appearance of the ear of corn that was important in selecting corn, but how well the corn produced, or how it performed. And so the beauty contest was ended, and the trophy sat in Ames with no real purpose. It was we believe it was put on display in Curtis Hall, which had just been built. And then no word was heard about it, and gradually the trophy disappeared. And it was gone from anybody's memory, any record of any kind for decades. And then in the 1980s, in a remodeling of Curtis Hall, they take down the false wall, and here's this massive trophy sitting there. What is this? University museums took charge and fixed the trophy up and put it on display in the Agronomy Hall in the late 1880s. There's some of you here may have seen it. I was down there. I never saw it. I don't remember it. But finally in 2011, Dean Winterstein took an interest in it and asked that it be brought back to Curtis Hall and put in an ag art gallery that she had commissioned to be established there. And the next year, Dr. John Piesick put an article in the university newsletter about it, and that was on the internet, and Dan saw that, and that triggered this mad rush to get the trophy loaned to Odebolt and to this presentation. So an interesting history. I'll try to skip through quickly on these things. Holden had a huge impact on Iowa. In 1903, we had a bad weather, and they were concerned about the seed quality. Holden started a big seed testing program at Iowa State and learned that perhaps half the corn would not germinate. This caused a panic, particularly for the northern Iowa seed dealers, and so he proposed taking the message right to the farmers using the railroads. So on April 18, 1904, the corn gospel train started their journey, leaving Des Moines, going through first to Gowrie, where 200 farmers were sitting waiting to hear the message. The car only held 100, so 100 farmers got to stand inside, and the other 100 stood outside the open windows to hear the instruction. And there was snow on the ground in April of that year. They did 60 stops in this 3-day trip, giving their presentations, honing their direction. But widely acclaimed, the first true extension outreach in the United States, and very successful. So successful that over the next year, that corn gospel train hit every dot on this map. By May of 1905, well over 1,000 talks to nearly 150,000 farmers. And they would do additional work the following year. The train arrived in Odebolt on March 13th, 1905. Libby, do you remember that? By this time, and this is not the train for Odebolt, but it does show 3 instruction cars there. By this time, they had learned to put more instruction cars on, and the same instruction was given in all 3 cars. About 20 minutes long, telling them how to select their ears, how to test their ears, how to plant their corn. Perry Holden then in 1906 made some landmark impacts on Iowa. He helped write the legislation that formed the Extension Service out of Iowa State, which was 8 years ahead of the federal program. He also wrote the drainage laws of the state, which is what I have lived. My career has been in ag drainage, so he's had a big impact on me as well. In 1911, the governor of Iowa credited him with increasing Iowa's corn production by 27 million bushels, about 30% yield improvement, and that was just over how to better select your seed and plant your seed. In 1912, several rural counties nominated him for governor. He was up against the Republican machine at the time, and he didn't make it. I don't think that's the reason that he left Iowa the next year, though. And he took a job with International Harvester and did similar extension work using trains again in southern United States promoting soybean production. Okay, back to Brookmont. Oh, by the way, the Brookmont photo is going to be landowners photo at the bank. It's going to be at 2:30, and we encourage you to be there on time or a little early. Thank you.
I think while we're in transition, the neat thing about, to me, the whole Holden tie and why we chose to talk about that was really ties into the trophy today. On Monday when that rolled in, I thought about all the history that was and kind of how it was a big triangle, where 2 of Holden's benefactors were from Odebolt. Here's this trophy that was given to Iowa State to Holden, and then 110 years later, we bring the trophy back and put it in the bank that Adams built, another one of Holden's benefactors, so it was kind of a neat little triangle. But okay, so back to Brookmont. When Albert took over, he really chose to run the farm really as a business. He was 80 years ahead of his time. He organized the farm into 3 divisions: livestock, seed, and farm. So he sold a lot of seed and also seed for his own farm. He practiced a rigorous crop and pasture planning methods ahead of their time. Each of the farms in his office, he had these big pull-down maps, and they showed the entire farm and then what was to be planted by color on every acre of every year. He experimented in multiple disease control methods. Obviously, he had a lot of money invested in these cattle, and he experimented in a lot of different ways, and he found out that having smaller groups, weekly cleanings, was much bigger than a larger scale or some of the newer methods that were being tried. He farmed with his head very proudly. He relied on his supervisors. He paid the division managers very handsomely. He enjoyed corner clipping. So as someone who works in a corporate environment, I'm very familiar with this. Spending time on finding ways to improve efficiencies. Equipment was bought in bulk, the same brand and same model. He was very generous with his best men. There are stories where he would provide cash bonuses to a foreman if his rows in his fields were straight, or he would, if a hand had saved an animal, he would give them a $10 bonus. There were all kinds of examples of that. He boasted that many of his workers were former hobos who now had thousands of dollars in the banks in Odebolt. He also took, and I think this is very nice, he took great pride in helping his men obtain their own land. And we know by 1910 that 104 of his former tenants had their own farms. And he would often loan them money, loan them equipment, and eventually would forgive the loan to help them out. And he believed that he would get the best out of his men if they believed that that Cook had their back and he was going to help them, and they knew that. Also, this is just a little interesting side, hogs were introduced on a larger scale at the farm after Albert took over, because Charles Willard Cook had hated hogs. And eventually, they would market 4,000 hogs. So that was another change that Albert thought he could make money on hogs, so he introduced a larger scale. This is some detail. I always kind of wondered, how did this whole tenant model work? And found a little detail in an article about kind of how they were paid. Each farm foreman, so there were 23 of them, could choose two methods of payment. They could either get $40 a month as a salary, or they could just essentially work on contract and sell their grain back to Cook under the stipulation that they would buy their seed from Cook, etc. Most men selected the contract method of payment because they found they could make more money doing it that way. Each of them also received $2.50 for each of the boarding hands that were living with them at the time. And the boarding hands and the number of them, depending on the season, that's how much they were paid. So January through March, it was $20 a month. As you begin the growing season, it was $25 a month. During the summer, it was $1.50 a day. And during harvest, it was $25 a month. So we found some detail there. The other interesting thing is that Brookmont wasn't the only show that Cook had. In our research, we also discovered a farm that was mysteriously called Brookmont 2 in southern Minnesota. And it was primarily a cattle operation. We don't know when he purchased it, but there was another farm in southern Minnesota. He also had 2,600 acres of land over in Monona County, which is another massive farm. He also had a 10,000-acre ranch in eastern Montana, 1,000 acres in Nevada, and then various buildings in Omaha and Chicago. I'm going to kind of go through the years here. 1902, began the work with Iowa State. The first cattle feeding test, there was 200 head, and they were fed various feeding regimens. And this first test was widely viewed in the cattle industry. You see some of the articles I found. I love Odebolt as the hub. But these 200 head were fed different feeding regimens, and then there was a special express train that took these cattle to Chicago. Remember the relationship with the railroad and the Hewitts. And that test was a huge success, so the test was going to be expanded for 1903. Also in 1902, a new steam-powered sawmill was Cook purchased to begin to process all of the cottonwood trees that were now 30 years old and make them into buildings around the farm. I mentioned the branch managers. Well, this was big. In 1902, he hired two college professors, one away from Iowa State and one away from Kansas State, to run divisions of the farm. So he was willing to pay these men very handsomely. The picture down here of the twin homes, I believe those were built for the two college professors back in 1902. The home on the left was the longtime home of the Keese family, and the home on the right was, when the farm broke up, was picked up by mules in 1920 and moved a quarter mile to the west on the north side of the road, and that became the Moffett, the Schwaller, the Noyd, the Etler home for 40 years, and for the last 15 years is the Matt and Janine Rash home. And that home is really the last surviving piece of the farm that is still up to date. Brookmont innovation. And this, we get into some of the inventions. Albert was a prolific inventor. I think that's what he really wanted to do, was be an inventor. In 1902, using the sawmill and all the cottonwoods, he built these two massive corn cribs. And this was kind of a surprise to us, because there was only one crib that we ever remembered. But we found this picture of it. And in association with an inventor from Sac City, S.E. Kurtz, they put in this innovative grain filling system where there was a small dump house between these massive cribs, and then there was a car that would run up to either one of the cribs, and when it got to the top, then the grain would go the length of the crib and be dumped into the correct holding bin that they desired the grain to go into. Each of these cribs were massive, basically 200 feet long, and they would hold up to 50,000 bushels of ear corn and 100,000 of shelled. And the West crib disappeared sometime between 1909. I can't find out what happened to it. I would guess it burned. But here's a close-up of that crib. You can see here for scale, that's a person. So these were just massive structures, and you can kind of see where the track up above there ran the whole length of the elevator. It looks like when they pulled the grain out, they would drop it through the tunnel there on the lower level, and it would come out underneath. But this crib would stand until 1983. Some other interesting things that happened in 1903 in May, a German delegation came to the United States, and they were sponsored by the United States Department of Agriculture, and the USDA set up this big tour for them to come across the United States. And they were to be in Iowa for 2 days. The first day they spent in Ames at Iowa State going around the campus. And the second day they took a special train to Odebolt to visit Brookmont Farm. Lunch was served at authentic, there's great detail on the dinner, or on the lunch. Christina Cook created this authentic German meal, and they served it on the second floor of the pavilion, and the Germans were just thrilled. And there were some farmers around there that obviously were back from the home country that still spoke German, and they were there as translators. But they marveled at the cribs, and they also marveled at a new grain that they had never seen before. Christina served popcorn to them for lunch, and they had never seen popcorn. So Perry Holden, who Dad just mentioned, found a cook stove at the ranch and popped popcorn for them, and that was the highlight of the trip for them. They all got to pop popcorn on this stove, and they took some back. They were just amazed they had never seen it before. The second cattle experiment was actually a big failure. 1903 was a bad weather year, and largely probably contributed to that. Some cattle were killed, blinded by bad feed. So the 1904 test of what was going to be 1,000 head was canceled. In 1905, I mentioned the Cook's 6 children. There was a tragedy. Alberta Christina Cook, who was just 15 months old, was apparently playing out in the yard at the farm, and she climbed a rock next to a stock tank, and she fell in and she drowned in 11 inches of water. They had a private funeral for her at the home the next day, and she is buried at the Odebolt Cemetery, and she is the only Cook that is buried out there, and she's still there today. I've driven by her hundreds of times and never knew she was there just until a couple weeks ago. There were also other tests with Iowa State, oat test. There was a beer barley test as well. Getting back to the patents, this is an amazing thing. In 1905, Cook and this Kurtz guy from Sac City patented this auto farmer motorized disc, one of the very first farm implements, motorized farm implements in existence. And obviously you can see the guy sat up there, big motor and disc, and this was the beginning of a long string of what became 43 patents that Albert had over the course of his life. And we actually have a book on the back table that has all 43 of them, and there's just some amazing things that he did. I'm going to talk here about the Brookmont letterhead. I found it's always neat to find signatures of some of the people that you're researching. I found that, and then this was the actual stationary letterhead that Cook used. So this is where we get the Cook's Brookmont Farm. That's what he called it, because that's what they called it on their stationery. Next slide. So in 1909, Cook was an inventor. He announced that he was going to downsize the farm, and the original intent was to just downsize it to 4 square miles from 12 square miles. So it was still going to be a massive farm. But he wanted to pursue other, what he called agriculturally related businesses over in Illinois. So the dispersion of the land begins then slowly. But you also still see a commitment to maintaining the cattle, because he bought 1,000 head that same year. Next. In that same year, he hired this company called the Payne Investment Company out of Omaha. And they were really hired to help disperse the land. So they were essentially kind of the realtors of the sale. And they published the book, the souvenir book, that's really one of the only pieces of information that we've had up until now about the farm. And it's very grandiose in its wording and bragging up the farm. One of the lines that my family we have laughed about for many, many years was a line in here about calling the farm fertilized with brains. And that really had to do more with Cook farming with his head than that, but we've always laughed about that, and fertilized with brains. But so in 1910, there was another big visit. So Odebolt, back in these days, when delegations came to Iowa to see what farming was about and see the best, they came here, okay? In 1910, another big delegation came to Odebolt from Iowa State, and this was over 80 from 36 different colleges. They were visiting Ames for some type of summer graduate course. And they in Ames for a day, and then they took another special train out to Odebolt here. And the big moment of pride for the community was in 1910, they were able to produce from local people 26 cars to transport these folks around the farms around Odebolt. So there's a picture of all the cars lined up down Main Street waiting for the train to pull in. They went around 4 stops around Odebolt, and the first one was out they went out to see the Cook farm out at Brookmont. And there's a picture down here in the lower level. Sorry, it's a little dark, but that's a picture taken from the east porch out looking to the northeast of all the delegation. And then they went around to other various farms, the Adams farm, and then they had a large steak supper at the Methodist Church that evening. This was another great find in our little quest. On May 14th, 1910, Forrest Chrissy, who was the ag writer for the Saturday Evening Post, wrote a 4-page article on the business of farming, and this is 100% dedicated to Albert Cook. So it's actually him speaking, quotes, everything. And that's where you get a lot of the great detail that I've been able to provide. It was through this article. But this is, obviously, the Saturday Evening Post in 1910 was one of the most widely read publications in the country. And Cook had a 4-page article in it. Now, this article, also, just for your information, is available for you to download on the Odebolt history pages. We made it accessible so you can go in and read it. It's interesting. Sorry, this is a little dark. This is another interesting piece. In 1913, Cook was going to move to Kankakee, Illinois, to get into his farm machinery business. And he traded some of his land over in Ottawa that I mentioned, the 2,600 acres over in Ottawa, for this Frank Lloyd Wright house in Kankakee. So you have one of the most famous architects in American history, and Cook lived in that home for 2 years, and then they moved back to Chicago. Don't know why they didn't stay there any longer. By 1914, Cook had decided to liquidate the farm altogether and sell off all the rest of the cattle. So this was the greatest sale in 20 years it was built, and the Brookmont Hereford herd is going to be liquidated. So here's an ad that was actually in the Chronicle, and several others appeared in cattle journals at the time. The detail on the final cattle dispersion sale. Obviously, the sales pavilion was packed to overflowing. Over 1,000 people were there, representing all the middle states, it said, Texas, Georgia, Kentucky, Canada, and Mexico. And J.C. Powell was the honored guest. He was the one who purchased the first Herefords from Albert's father in 1884. So he was still around, and he came back as the guest of honor. And there was apparently this big picture of Cook and Powell with the last prize bull kind of before the sale started. Few of the cattle stayed local. Most of them were purchased by large breeders from around the country. The herd was at that time down to just 188, so this was just kind of at the very end. The Brookmont Congressional Church ladies' lunch wagon made $283 at this sale, and they were just over the moon excited about that. Okay? And at this time, there was still about 1,800 acres left of the farm yet to sell. So this is kind of the final years. In 1914, we believe that was the Cook's family's last season at the farm. We know in 1916 and 1917 that the last Brookmont farm manager, a gentleman by the name of James, they called him Shelton, his family got to live in the mansion because the Cooks weren't there. So that must have been quite a treat for them. Discovered this little blurb in February of 1917. That mansion's roof caught fire, and they caught it in time. But it would be amazing to to know how history would be different had that house burned down before all the Wrights and everything took the farm over. And then in 1918, that was when the last piece of the farm was sold, and then Brookmont ended after a 45-year history. So what did Albert do next? Well, he formed what was called the Cook Motor Corporation in Kankakee, Illinois, and they built two versions of what was called a large farm truck that had a patented, and I have the patent over there, it had a patented adjustable wheelbase that you could extend or make short. Still don't quite understand how it worked. It was capitalized in 1919 for $2.5 million. So we believe that Cook put a lot of his own money into this company. He was the president. And the other interesting thing is you look through who was on the board of directors, all of the board of the directors of this company had ties to Odebolt. R.W. Sayre was the president of the First National Bank when Cook was here. He was the vice president. And C.E. Ulrich was the general. He had worked for Cook out at the farm. So there's all these Brookmont ties to this truck company. In 1920, they brought a truck back to Odebolt to be tested. And it was here for several weeks. And there's a big article again in the paper about the Cook truck being back from Kankakee. We don't know then what happened really with this company. We're digging into it a little bit further. But obviously the 1920s were not real great for farmers, and then the 30s were even worse. And there was a lot of competition and other things. So we really don't know what happened. And then this is the last years. After Kankakee in 1915, the Cooks moved to a beautiful mansion on the shores of Lake Michigan, just north of Northwestern. They had their own private beach on Lake Michigan. It's amazing. At some point, they began to move around. By the 1930 census, Albert and Christina were living with one of their daughters. And then in 1940, they were living with another one of their daughters. And Christina died sometime between 1948 and 1956. I can't read the stone. And then Albert died in 1956 at the age of 91. And they're all interred with the two generations prior at the very famous Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. And that's the end of our story. Are there any questions, or how you'd like to do this? What do we want to do?
I'm sure that you will have memory. You that are part of Brookmont will have memories of that. But we'd certainly like to talk to you about it afterwards here, if you like. We did go just about 5 minutes past an hour, and I apologize for that. There's a lot of exhibits in the back here, and especially check out that railroad map, and we want to visit with you as well. There'll be another show at 10:30 of the same presentation. Remind you that to catch that trophy at the bank, to catch the Brookmont float, and you'll know that's the sales pavilion now when it goes by. And at 2:30 sharp, we're going to try to take that group photo of the Brookmont people with the trophy at the bank. We hope you'll be there. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.